Today's session on integrated ecosystem-based approaches for analyzing the environmental impacts of offshore energy development. My name is Kristen Strellec, and I am an economist with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in our Office of Environmental Programs. I will be moderating this session, and I am pleased to provide a brief introduction to our 5 expert panel members who will be presenting on their experiences and challenges related to the development and application of various modeling tools to support ecosystem-based management. First up, we have Jake Levenson, a scientist with BOEM, who will talk about the need for EBM, as well as our Bureau's vision for implementation of it. Second, I've lost my notes. Second, we have Deyle from Boston University, who will present on a recent study conducted with BOEM entitled Standardizing Integrated Ecosystem-Based Assessments. Third, Howard Townsend from NOAA will elaborate on NOAA's system approach to EBM. And following Howard, Andrew Lipsky from NOAA Fisheries will share his expertise on physical and biological interactions and changes to ecosystems as a result of offshore stressors. And lastly, Beth Fulton from Australia's National Science Agency will be joining us remotely to present on cumulative effects assessments. We are here to discuss common challenges and opportunities to help move these complex approaches forward in a fast-paced and bureaucratic world. We look forward to a robust Q&A session, as well as future discussions and collaborations as we move forward. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jacob Levenson.
Thanks, Kristen. It's a little weird being referred to as an expert, but I'll take it. So thank you all so much for joining today's symposium. And I'm really hoping today continues to advance the state of the science of ecosystem-based energy management. So over the past few days, it's been really wonderful to see the array of presentations, everything from bird collision risks and passive acoustic monitoring and all these great abilities to collect information, whether it's physical oceanography, social science, all sorts of advanced technology. But as exciting as all that is, I feel like it's here where that all comes together, where all the pieces of the puzzle come together. Not that I have bias or anything, but maybe a little. I'm really looking forward to our panel presentation today, and thank you all for joining us. I kind of envision this being sort of like a safe space for us to all chat about some of the challenges that we face and some of the successes we've had. I should mention today, by the way, this is an effort across a tremendous number of staff. I sort of feel like I have a friend that calls me Hurricane Jake, and that I pick up debris in one place and drop it in another. And my girlfriend thinks the same thing at home. But really, what'll happen is I'll meet somebody in the hallway at work or hear of somebody's expertise and be like, "Oh, you should be involved in this, and you should be involved in this." And next thing we know, we've got this. Every conversation that you and I have, Kristen, is we have this massive effort that is gaining momentum at BOEM. So I'd like to provide an overview of what we've been up to in the environmental studies program to advance our ecosystem-based management. And it's related to our responsibilities under OCSLA, under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. So over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through sort of our ambitious vision for developing EBM at BOEM and why we want to and why we need to incorporate this approach. I'm pretty confident that we're all on the same page here, given the conference we're all at. But just to be sure, maybe I might start a little basic here for a minute, because this has the potential, I want to make sure we're all aligned, because this has the potential to really impact every aspect of what we do, from protected species to environmental justice and everything in between. And I'll share some brief insights from our recently concluded study on standardizing ecosystem-based management, energy management, or SEBA, as we've been calling it. But Ethan, after me, will dive into that in a bit more detail. And lastly, I'll outline, and I hope you'll contribute to the next step on our EBM journey here. But first, I'd like to share a little personal note. aside from the fact that you guys know me now as Hurricane Jake. I often feel sort of like the science geek version of an action hero star, especially when it comes to EBM. To an outsider in the government, it might seem like we're a slow-moving bureaucracy, and it definitely feels that way sometimes. But from my perspective, especially with this study, it feels more like a bullet train, or a rocket ship, or high-speed car chase. Choose your preferred analogy. The point is here is that the energy process really is always in motion, and science needs are always evolving, and we're always wanting to keep up and stay on top of that. So at BOEM, our vision entails really having a dynamic, integrated approach that unites our diverse disciplines, include things like acoustics, physical and chemical and biological oceanography, social science, economics, fisheries, among others. Our objective is not only to make informed decisions for the present, but also to anticipate future potential scenarios, and in an approach that reflects the realities of the natural world, avails sort of nonlinear relationships, and promotes transparent communication. By adopting a dynamic ecosystem perspective, we really can gain insights into the interactions among various ocean users and can explore scenarios that can help us optimize outcomes for all stakeholders. This perspective helps us identify synergies as well as challenges to avoid. So our vision in a nutshell really is to clearly inform decision makers like the Secretary of Interior, as well as stakeholders and partners of the connectedness and complexity of changing ocean systems and uses. Nothing in the ocean, as we all know, is static, and the idea is to have our assessment reflect this dynamic ecosystem. So the basics of why we need this. I'm pretty sure, I hope that maybe we're all on the same page here. But EBM allows us to address many of the challenges we face across BOEM. Embracing EBM allows us to expedite analysis. It allows us to increase efficiency across the agency. You know, there are always more responsibilities but no more resources, right? So now there's carbon sequestration and the territories as well under BOEM's responsibility. So finding ways to increase the efficiency across the agency is definitely something that we're always looking for. But for me also, and this is sort of a personal thing, is engaging stakeholders more meaningfully, efficiently and meaningfully by modernizing how we conduct engagement and communicate our assessments. I don't know if you've ever been to a BOEM public meeting before, but I feel like they could be, we can improve the efficiency and how we can modernize and communicate what we do in the various decision scenarios. But really, most importantly, this allows us to maintain and even in some cases enhance ecosystem services. Oh, my study just advanced there. But this can allow us to maintain or enhance in the ecosystem services like fishing and tourism and other things like that. So that brings me to the recently completed SEBA study. This is so recently completed that the final report we just got on Friday, and many of us haven't had a chance to even read it yet. But the point of this study that we've been working hard on for, feels like is it 2 years now? It might be a while, is to develop a robust national framework and a strategic plan for implementing EBM at BOEM, and something that we want people to feed into. And over the course of the past 2 years, we've convened a series of workshops, stakeholders from across government, academia, and environmental NGOs to gather expert input. And the idea was that the process here was designed for the co-production of knowledge between equal partners, between biophysical modelers, social scientists, and interfacing through a workshop team and an expert working group that captured a broad range of perspectives. When I say this project casts a wide net, it was a very wide net. So, but we had, as you can imagine, when you're trying to take a bite of something that's this big and touches every aspect of the agency, there's no shortage of challenges here. And BOEM's timelines for things like offshore wind permitting are fairly fixed and don't leave much time for integrating or test driving new methods. I always wish that I could just kind of sit around and kick the tires about cool stuff and cool ways to do things better. But unfortunately, the pace and time keeps marching on. And so we have to be able to adjust and work within those timelines. And so as a result, we have to be very thoughtful and deliberate in how new approaches may integrate or even change existing standing processes. But the idea here was to take a systems model approach as opposed to the typical input-output models, which was another challenge that many of us at BOEM, who are familiar with more input-output type work, struggled to wrap our heads around. And I'm sure Ethan's going to show some stuff that I still probably struggle to wrap my head around, but I look forward to being able to learn that stuff more. And another challenge was making that connection between human and natural dimensions on the shore environment with changes in offshore activities. And of course, there's the challenge of integrating a holistic EBM system into the existing regulatory process. So there was no shortage of challenges, but again, we moved the ball down the field pretty, at least to start here, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next. But, there's also something I wanted to mention about the impact of AI and machine learning without getting too science fiction on y'all here. We're living in a real transformative period in human history. And maybe, Howard, I don't mean to throw you under the bus here right away, but integrating the different layers and the multitude of data that we have here efficiently is, I think, an area where I think we can start seeing machine learning coming in and improving that. So we're living in this really transformational period in our history. And we're increasingly and profoundly influenced by the impact of machine learning. And my hope is that this can also help us find those greater efficiencies for leveraging EBM, the things that were previously would send me cowering in the fetal position under my desk about the amount of data in it. I'm hoping that things like machine learning can help us make more sense and make things less overwhelming and more practical to process. But I think that machine learning and the impact of it into our management processes can help us reduce adverse impacts and uncover potential scenarios that we didn't know or mitigation options that we weren't aware of at first. Things like optimizing placement and operations to minimize disruption and engaging stakeholders with clear, transparent data to foster collaboration. And lastly, I've got 2 minutes left. Okay. Lastly, leveraging our machine learning effectively because we just have a tremendous amount of data, and that data is increasing all the time. So how can we use that to enhance our predictions, improve management strategies over time, and adapt to emerging patterns or forecasting potential nonlinear relationships that might emerge from all this data collection? So there's still a long way to go to make this happen. We need to spend some work on integrating human dimensions components into that. I think that was one of the bigger challenges that we learned and something that still needs to happen. We still need a thorough understanding and documentation for the models that we're building, a standardized pathway for model output and improved efforts and processes, and development of a full-time dedicated process to upkeep a model. Keeping models up to date takes time and staff. So right now we have a basic model, and Ethan is going to highlight that effort. But we need to ensure that we can incorporate it into the many possible development scenarios that best serve BOEM's needs, as well as obviously being peer-reviewed and all that stuff. But this takes us one step further and provides even more context for the decisions we're making. Static models do a great job of painting the picture where things are and where they've been. But my hope is, by incorporating dynamic models, like a dynamic forecasting model, can give us more insight into what could happen given different locations or configurations and provide that longer-term programmatic perspective. All of this together, I hope, is a path for a more robust, transparent, and consistent process. So with that concludes my quick remarks here. I'll turn it over to Ethan from here. So thanks.
Good morning. Is this a good microphone? Do I need to get any closer? We're good? Okay. I may under-deliver a little bit on what Jake promised, given the amount of time I have. But so I'm going to try to give a short vignette on sort of a piece of this big work we undertook, and hopefully sort of also give some of the broader context while I do it, but hopefully give you something bite-sized we can track through beginning to end in just 10 minutes, 12 minutes, something around that. So this is going to be focused on the dynamic modeling part of this broader project, and in particular in our first attempt to what Les Kaufman calls instantiating our framework to an actual place and problem. So, and that was to the Gulf of Maine during the ongoing decision-making and build-out that's happening there. So you'll see on the left a representation of our model domains, on the right a now outdated picture of the WIA selection process. But again, the core methodology of the project at large was this collaborative process that was designed for the co-production of knowledge. So the modeling team was an equal partner with a human dimensions team, and then we were interfacing through a workshop team with an expert working group that was designed to capture a broad range of perspectives on what the largest conceptualization of the ecosystem could be, all of the different human values, human uses and human values that might be relevant to thinking about offshore wind build-out in the context of the whole rest of the ocean ecosystem and blue economy. Right, the process was rooted in this expert engagement process, and up here, one of our collaborators, Carrie Capel, likes to make these diagrams, so I call them Capel diagrams. They show sort of the iterative process of input, participation, feedback, and revision, where you often feel like you're moving backwards a little bit, but surely enough, you're actually progressing towards a goal. So this is the workshop design, an iterated series of workshops. A few folks from our expert working group are in the room. Thank you so much. And that same motif really should be represented in the way that the biophysical modeling and the human dimensions integrate also. It should be an iterative process. There should be revision within the teams as they go, because otherwise what you end up with is sort of the old status quo, which is that modelers make a model and then ask for social scientists to sign off at it at the end. And at least half the people in this room probably don't like that. So the goal was to start the conversations and the revisions at the beginning and track it all the way through. So from the boundaries of the whole project, the broadest designs of the scope of what might be modeled, down to exactly what questions you ask the model and do with the data. So within these conversations, we agreed broadly early on that we needed to employ a dynamic modeling approach. So Jake brought this up a little bit, the distinction between static models and dynamic models. So there are a lot of advantages to static models, and in fact, we benefit a lot from ongoing static modeling from folks at NCOS and NOAA. But there are certain realities of coupled human and natural systems in the ocean that static models don't really capture, right? So, and one of those is what I'm zooming in on today, which is the fact of, well, in the Gulf of Maine, the ocean space is changing rapidly. It's warming faster than 99% of the rest of the ocean. If you have a map of hotspots of conflict now, and you're trying to assess the cumulative impacts of a project that has 20 to 30 years of a timeline, are those the right hotspots to be making your decisions about, right? And if you have a static model or if you have an equilibrium model even, you're not really going to get there. A dynamic model is necessary to do some of this forward-looking, right, to think about the warming system, but also to think about the readjustments that happen in a system, right? When you change patterns on the ocean, other patterns will change in response. You need that dynamic readjustment. Ultimately, both of them need to be used in parallel. And we had the benefit of there already being static modeling work being done for the same project. So we could dovetail very nicely, focus on the dynamic modeling. But when volume 1 of our final report is out, you can read all about sort of the synergies and the framework for using both static and dynamic modeling. Specifically, we had the expertise to focus on something called multi-scale integrated model of ecosystem services. It's called MIMES. So we were developing a MIMES model that really is accounting for the flow of ecosystem services in a coupled human and natural system. So we're modeling ecosystem processes. We have a biophysical model. We're also modeling macroeconomics, right? The relationship between supply and demand from ecosystem services. And then the flow from the ecosystem to the economic sector we think of as ecosystem services. And those human activities that generate the benefits also have impacts. So that's sort of the broadest ontology of the model. Noting that the economics are conceptualized in a broad enough scope so that we're not just thinking about dollar values. So there's specific economic machinery there, using shadow prices and these sorts of things to accommodate much wider values than just, the amount of things built or the amount of energy captured. But I'm not the expert on that. So I'm going to move on. So MIMES, this general framework, right, is extremely flexible. That's also a danger because it's always possible to add more detail. And when a member of an expert working group says, what about this? It's easy to say, oh, we can do that. The solution is to use the minimum complexity of space, of functional scales to accommodate the best available science. What are we really trying to do? We're trying to develop an arena where all the things we have the most confidence about can all be put together to see what happens. We have some idea of how different species respond to different disturbances, how different human behaviors readjust, right? We're trying to put those in a common framework to see how it all comes together, right? But we always have to work towards minimum complexity because it's always possible to add more detail, right? So, what did we get? Minimum complexity. What was the minimum complexity we thought we needed to accommodate the best available science? Well, it was 17 coastal counties, 242 ocean polygons, 15 biophysical components with 12 impacts of human uses across 15 human uses. So 17, 242, 15, 12, 15, kind of multiplied together, not added, right? Minimum complexity. I think we succeeded, folks, right? Again, this is why I'm not going to try to tell you the whole story, but with all this together, we can begin to reconcile the overlaps and conflicts between these ecosystem components and the human uses in space at a scale relevant to planning against a backdrop of a system that's warming rapidly. So this is taken from Niekoff's. This is a reanalysis product. It's one of our best guesses of what has been happening in the Gulf of Maine at a scale of spatial resolution relevant for planning. You'll see not only is the Gulf of Maine warming decade to decade, even going back to, at this point, 3 decades past to 2 decades past. The warming is very heterogeneous within the Gulf of Maine. It's warming faster than 99% of the ocean, and parts of it are warming much, much faster than other parts of it. This really matters. There are places where we're thinking about putting wind turbines that are heating way faster than other places. Right, this is what it looks like within any one individual grid cell. And we know already this warming has been happening, and conflicts have been changing between the things that we're concerned about in planning for offshore wind. There are new emerging conflicts, for example, between lobstering and North Atlantic right whale. North Atlantic right whale started showing up all of a sudden somewhere it had never been before, and there was a big mortality event in 2017, right? This is not even the most recent bad news for the North Atlantic right whale. And at the same time, lobster fishing and lobster populations have been shifting dramatically across the North Atlantic seaboard, right? We cannot address these interaction by maps alone, because which maps do you use, right? To try to think about the future, we have to take our best guesses. Our best guesses right now come from the cutting edge of global models, right? They're starting to get down to scales of kilometers instead of tens or hundreds of kilometers. That's just enough to actually really start to represent the Gulf of Maine. But whatever product we use, and the one we happen to use is up here, but it doesn't matter, they all have biases. These global models aren't completely true to the real systems. So what we do, instead of looking at the actual prediction, is we predict the change, right? They're biased, but they tend to overestimate in the same places under different scenarios. So if we take their differences, we have something more reliable. So we can start to come up with rates of change, and then we can translate those into changes in the biophysical system, like lobster. Changes in the distribution of lobster expected with no climate change or with sort of the worst case scenario, which unfortunately we're still on. But just like the global climate models, just the same way that the ICPP uses these different scenarios, this is really what we need to be doing the ecosystem models too. The ecosystem models, no matter how carefully we parameterize them and calibrate them, which takes a lot of time that we haven't had yet, ultimately looking at scenario differences is where we're going to have the most confidence. And that goes back to where static models are extremely important, because they tell us, based on now, what to expect. We can look at scenario differences here and see how that map might change under a scenario of management, under a scenario of climate change. So that really comes towards mostly vetted proposition at this point, which is really that these dynamic models, the way we think about deploying them, we can really take analogy from best practices in climate modeling, even though we're much, much behind them as a modeling field. Hopefully there'll be some questions about this later, but for now, thank you. Thank you to the other folks, the workshop team that weren't on the first slide, our Human Dimensions team, and all the folks from BOEM that gave lots of time and emotional energy across the process. Thank you.
Back to the tech room and get someone.
Tell me something.
Oh. Okay, be gentle with the computer.
Okay, and next up we have Howard Townsend from NOAA.
Thanks to Kristen and Jake and Stephanie for inviting me for this session and for everyone convening. I'm Howard Townsend. I'm an ecosystem modeling coordinator for NOAA Fisheries Service. Before we get started, show of hands, anybody here ever done any ecosystem modeling? Anybody somewhat familiar with ecosystem modeling? Okay, good. All right. Anybody has no idea what's going on here? All right. I appreciate honesty. Yeah, good. I want to make sure so I wanted to have some answers to some questions I wanted to start to answer a little bit. But first I need to, just tell you a little bit about NIMS and EBM and then talk about some ecosystem modeling and what it is, at least in sort of our NOAA Fisheries view of the world. And I should say I'm NOAA Fisheries Office of Science and Technology. So offshore wind folks probably interacted more with protected resources and habitat folks. So I'm coming at things from a different angle a bit. Also, we'll talk about some places where we've actually gotten ecosystem models to be used in management using the existing management structures, as Jake referenced, and then some ideas of how to go forward and with impacts our other energy and other uses out in the ocean. So just real quick about NOAA fisheries, we have 6 regional councils we work with and 3 commissions we work with for fisheries management in the exclusive economic zone within these large marine ecosystems. We have our science centers and our regional offices all around the U.S., on the coast, of course, and also working with the SRGs and other international groups and doing stuff in Antarctica. So we're doing this a lot of places all over. I've been in this job for 20 years, and I'd say in the past 5 years, we're actually starting to move towards ecosystem-based fisheries management, but I'll get into that in a second. Other thing about NOAA is we have 450 fish species that are under, we have to manage 117 marine mammals and 93 endangered species we have to deal with, 2,000 habitat actions, plus 200 or so aquaculture actions, all kinds of NEPA things that we're dealing with, a lot to do. And so one of the reasons to do ecosystem modeling is can we pull a lot of things in one model to get a lot of answers out of it, hopefully. But I'm going to focus mostly on the research and modeling synthesis assessment side of what we do in NOAA fisheries. And just real quick with EBFM. So historically, we've done single species management. And I'm going to say fish a lot, but I've also acknowledged we do habitat and endangered species and all that, but I tend to lean towards fish a lot because that's where we kind of have some more rigorous management structures and modeling going on. So we've done single species. We got that pretty well under control. We know how to do that. We've moved into ecosystem approaches to fisheries management, but where we start to, it's still sort of single species centric, but we're pulling in climate and habitat and other drivers besides just the population dynamics and harvest sort of, we're also moving towards ecosystem-based fisheries management. And I should say this is part of our EBFM roadmap or policy that we released in 2016. We're updating it, and I don't know if it's all out now, but it will be soon if not. Where now we're not looking at just single species, we're having the species interact a bit and also including some of those external factors. And at the top level is EBM, and as Jay pointed out, BOEM is also trying to move in that direction. And I think one of the tricks here is I don't think any agency alone can do this. We all kind of have to coordinate together on this because we all have different levers and knobs that we can control within an ecosystem. And I just had to highlight that we are thinking about energy and wind a good bit in those fisheries as we move towards EBM. Real quick on ecosystem modeling. So we have a range of types of models we use in NOAA fisheries. As I mentioned before, like the single species stock assessment models, we move it up to more, adding some environmental covariates and other things that make it a little more ecosystem-y, if I can use that word. Up to, okay, now let's think about these as functional groups and how they interact in the food web, to pulling in, food web and biogeochemistry and climate, all sorts of factors to these sort of end-to-end models, and doing integrated ecosystem assessment. So beyond just a single species stock assessment, but integrating multiple factors, and sometimes maybe fish aren't the most important factor in that, but a factor. And the other thing to point out here is it's conceptual models. I didn't know where it really fit on the spectrum because you can make those very complex because you don't have to quantify things. But the two main software packages we're using, and this is no means an advertisement, it's just these happen to be the ones that we've made progress with as far as moving into the management realm and getting these models used in management, are sort of EcoPath with Ecosystem and Atlantis. And Beth Fulton will be around a bit to tell a bit about Atlantis, so I won't go into too much detail on these, but they are spatial you can make them spatial ecosystem models, which I think is a key factor when you're looking at other uses in the marine space like wind and other energy and other sectors, actually. So why do we do ecosystem modeling in NIMS for living resource management? We have to look at linkages among the living marine resource trust species. That's just a fancy way of saying fish and marine mammals and all the other things I've listed. But also to take into account things like predation, habitat, climate, things going on with the oceanography. We often use them as an operating for management strategy evaluation and scenario planning. I'll go into that in a minute. we're also been strong advocates because we sit in NOAA and we have colleagues in the Weather Service who are always using model ensembles and multiple models. We're advocates for using multiple models, right? Because no model captures everything perfectly, so it's good to deal with uncertainty that way. And we also want to use these for impact and risk assessment and to look at trade-offs. It's a tough thing to talk about, but yeah, if you want some of one thing, then you might get less of another thing. It's a fact of life. We have biophysical constraints, and so that's probably one of the things that slows us down in making the ecosystem-based management sort of leaps is, we're going to have to decide what our priorities are and make some objectives. And I just also wanted to list a bunch of papers that, showing how we've gotten these to now be used in menhaden management to help make some decisions about the sediment diversion projects in coastal Louisiana, setting an ecosystem cap for Bering Sea groundfish, just several areas we've been using for looking at ecosystem services from oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, and finally, I do have a paper from 2019 kind of summarizing where we were in 2019. So all those other papers, it's sort of, we're starting to really take off now, and it's kind of exciting. How to use these models? We use them in integrated ecosystem assessments, and I'll just highlight here that the integrated ecosystem assessment idea is that you kind of decide what your EBM goal is. I can't read this screen, so small. You develop some indicators. You then assess the ecosystem, usually with some sort of model. Then you analyze sort of uncertainty and risk, also using that model, and then go back to the drawing board to evaluate those strategies, and then maybe adjust how you implement your actions and go through that loop. So that's the integrated ecosystem assessment loop, and that's sort of how you keep doing EBM in perpetuity and keep learning as you go and adapting. So it's sort of adaptive management at an ecosystem-based sort of level. And specifically, we often like to use conceptual models when you're kind of refining how do we understand how the system works, right? Because if you think about, you have a group of stakeholders that you're trying to get on the same page. Every stakeholder in the room has got their own mental model of what's happening in the system. So if you can get a conceptual model that everybody sort of will agree to, like, okay, that's a big step right there. Then to start to quantify that model, to use it as an operating model and management strategy evaluation, sort of the next big step. And so I'll talk about management strategy evaluation a bit. And this idea, this is basically, I'm maybe stealing some of Beth's thunder here, but basically the idea is to conduct management experiments in silico, right? It's hard to do big, large-scale ecosystem experiments in the real world, but in a model, you could have a model of the physical system, you could have different human activities like fishing and energy extraction and those sorts of things that might have an impact on that biophysical system. You could think about social networks and all the sort of socioeconomic sides of things that would drive those things that would influence the system. You can also model the management. What are the decision rules? If the fishery level goes down to this level, we change the harvest to that level, et cetera, and incorporate those statistics. Incorporate even monitoring within, if we change our monitoring structure, or what does the monitoring tell us about the system? Because we don't know exactly what's going on in the system. We know through monitoring, right? So you can simulate all that, under different strategies, management strategies, with your different objectives, and look at all the different scenarios to say, where do we land on our various objectives, and sort of use that to move forward making decisions. And so I think, and I've seen a lot of this happening. I'm just real quick points to make here with how to think about this with offshore wind is, I've seen a lot of folks kind of do that conceptual modeling. You work with stakeholders, get their ideas. Less so, I've not seen as much of the ecosystem modeling, and I've been talking a lot about large marine ecosystem modeling. You could also build an ecosystem model, a food web model of, a wind farm. And actually this figure here from the ecospace is some work in France where they did that. But then I also say, once you get your conceptual model and build your ecosystem model, it's, to me, sort of your working quantitative hypothesis. And as you get new information, you can hang it on there and revise and that sort of thing. And I've seen, it's also a good way to integrate. You know, we've got lots of information from a lot of different studies, a lot of different sites. We can start to integrate all that together into a larger ecosystem model to understand larger impacts. And again, as you get new knowledge, revise your model, move forward. Take-home points, we're moving towards EBFM, IEAs, MSEs, ecosystem modeling are kind of the ways we've been successful in doing tactical and strategic decision support for management. We can use these to look at short-term impacts, you know, or longer-term impacts. And again, recommending a conceptual model and then a spatial ecosystem model that you build on. And I should say, the one tricky part that we're still sorting out here is how to do the review, the level of review of these models that's necessary. Because we're working with existing structures and stock assessment models, we're trying to fold in how do you do this with the ecosystem models, and we're starting to, we've had a few successful cases there. So anyway, I'm Howard Townsend. I'll be glad to answer questions later or chat with you later. Thanks a lot.
And next up, we have Andy Lipsky from NOAA Fisheries.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank my co-authors who should probably be up here. So I have a few caveats before I start. Abby Terrell and Lisa Methrada. Abby Terrell is one of our ecosystem scientists who was hired to advance ecosystem science and addressing offshore wind energy needs. And she's unable to be here today, so you got me, C-Team. Another caveat. So I'm going to talk about, I was asked to talk about some of the interactions. What do we understand? What do we know about offshore wind energy development and interactions with the marine ecosystem? So talk a little bit about what those interactions are. What do we know? What don't we know? What do we need to know? So that's a lot there. I have to do this in 10 minutes. And then probably the most unsatisfying piece of my presentation will be, what are some of these considerations based on what we understand that can feed these tools, these ecosystem tools? Whether we like it or not, we are now thrust into having to apply EBM, offshore wind development, at the scale that we're developing it, and the many interactions across the things that we care about demand that we actually apply EBM. Whether we like it or not, we're being sort of dragged into this. Our systems may not be prepared for EBM, but we have to do it. So I have a few slides just talking about an example of an approach of developing a conceptual model in the Gulf of Maine, and I'll finalize with some of the considerations for how do we advance some of these ecosystem tools. I'm not going to cover, thank you, Howard, you covered a few things that I don't have to cover, but EBM is an integrated management approach, recognizes that interactions are happening across the ecosystem. Humans are part of that ecosystem, and we're trying to move away from single issue areas. I heard in the beginning of this talk, Jake talked about ecosystem-based energy management from BOEM, and then Howard mentioned our agency is trying to pursue ecosystem-based fisheries management, right? But we need to do EBM, which is combining those things. So that's a super challenge. And so how do we integrate those approaches across the ecosystem? Well, first you need to understand the ecosystem, particularly in the context of offshore wind energy development. So marine ecosystem science needs to consider the human dimensions, the societal elements, everything that's happening in the ocean, the biology that's happening in the ocean, and the physics and the chemistry that's happening in the ocean. And all of this interacts with advancing offshore energy development, offshore wind energy development in particular. Now I'll just dig into what are those interactions? What do we know? Well, there's many stages of development. And what's unique about offshore wind energy relative to some other marine uses is that we are adding stationarity to the system. We're installing cables, we're installing structures for a lifespan of 30 or 50 years in places in the ocean that are very dynamic. And so we have development interactions at the multiple phases of the life cycle of a project. So you have the planning phases where we're doing pre-construction surveys that last a couple years. We have the construction phases, which generally last a couple years. And then we have the operational phases of these projects where generally it's about 30 years, but maybe it's more than 50, up to 50 years of operations. And then you have the decommissioning phases, and that's roughly 2 years. So I just talked about 62 years of the cycle of development. And the interactions in the ecosystem will be different depending on where we are at in the cycles of development. So that's something that we need to consider. The other consideration to ecosystem interactions and the types of stressor receptor responses that we want to model and understand so we can apply these EBM tools is that there are differences at the life cycle development, and there's differences in the type of engineering that's going to be used for development. There'll be differences in interactions from fixed turbine construction activities in generally less than 60 meters of water, and then what we'll see in areas like the Gulf of Maine or the Pacific Coast in areas greater than 60 meters of water for floating wind interactions. So this is everything I'm going to say today. There's probably pieces of these slides that are presented in much more detail. Some of them we have made some advancements in understanding, but this, in general, I'm just going to go over some of these impact-producing effects that we understand to be true or we think are to be true relative to wind energy development. The first large one that happens both at a local level and a regional level and potentially the ecosystem level are the impacts of offshore wind wake effects, both marine wakes and atmospheric wakes. And there was plenty of talks over the last few days that discussed the potential of these types of effects from changes in the oceanography due to the installation of structures, from the harvesting of energy in the atmospheric, moving kinetic energy from the system, to the increased circulation caused by increased turbulence, which has the potential to change boundary layers like salinity and potential changes in the biological system as well. This is an example from the North Sea and the hydrodynamic modeling approach. Again, not in the U.S., but in the North Sea, where we see changes in stratification and increased mixing and decreases in mixing due to offshore wind energy development happening both at the site level and happening over the sea basin scale level. So these changes, again, these are areas, an effect that's potentially small or large and mostly model-based in terms of what we understand to be true. Some of the potential interactions of these changes in marine wake and atmospheric wake effects on the biology are particularly compelling to managers in terms of how they can impact trust resources such as the North Atlantic right whale. So this is from the NOAA BOEM North Atlantic right whale strategy, so a joint document, and presents a conceptual case. So this has not been proven to be true. This is just shows the types of interactions, the engineering, the physics, and the biology that we could see interactions from marine wake effects, where we have changes in ocean circulation, offshore energy development, and a place where we have high prevalence and persistence of North Atlantic right whales. This would be an area south of Nantucket Shoals in the vicinity. Changes in potential zooplankton availability, which could potentially change health conditions in animals that are already stressed because of their injuries sustained through impacts from fishing gear, for instance. And then potential population level effects. Other effects that we want to understand to model interactions at the ecosystem level is the artificial reef effects. Again, these interactions could be positive, negative, or not at all. So what we know to understand is that when we add hard structure to the ocean, we attract organisms across the food web. Populations are affected by these changes due to food availability, predators, and shelter. We know a lot at what happens at the turbine level. We know very little at what happens at the regional level or the population level. Is it an attraction, or are we increasing productivity? An example of this was at the Block Island turbine, where we actually have data, and Dara Wilbur presented this yesterday, where we do see a signal of a hard structure-loving organism like black sea bass, where we have a tenfold increase at the location. It's unknown whether that's based on attraction or its productivity, but black sea bass is an important commercial and recreational species. If we're trying to model at an ecosystem level, how do we use this information if we don't understand whether it's a populational effect or if we're just changing distributions? We don't know that yet. Obviously, underwater sound is a major interaction with the marine ecosystem. We know a lot about underwater sound, but we don't know a lot about underwater sound across all the truss species and life history stages of species that we care about. And we don't necessarily understand how to integrate the stressor receptor responses with multiple projects happening. Similar to underwater sound is electromagnetic fields created by power cables, whether it's going to be floating or fixed. We have some studies at the species level, some studies at other life history stages. In general, these look to be negligible impacts, but we don't know across the full range of species and trust resources. And so continued work is necessary to understand at population or community levels. So the human interactions are also very important. We have fishing communities, 177 fishing communities in the Northeast region, and there's very little part of the ocean that isn't touched by the food sector in terms of the wild harvest of fisheries and also recreational fisheries. In these interactions, we have offshore wind energy developments that are procuring power to a state, but we may have fishermen from another state using the wind energy area that's delivering to the other state. So there's different wind energy developments will overlap with different fisheries. And when we think about the cumulative impacts, what's happening when we add one turbine, what happens when we add one wind energy area, and then we have multiple wind energy projects. And then we think about what that means to our stressor receptor relationships through those major interaction or stressor types. So there's multiple scales of biological organization to consider in these cumulative impacts, the different life history stages I showed in the previous slide. It's negligible impacts from EMF, but we are learning that some early life history stages of gadids, for instance, change their swimming behavior when exposed to low-frequency sound or EMF. So what type of impacts over many projects could that have across a species range? So we think about individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. And then we have multiple habitats, benthic, pelagic, and coastal. And then we have the multiple environmental effects that I mentioned earlier, the physical, chemical, or the geological. And then we have also multiple human interactions. We conducted an integrated ecosystem assessment with the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance with effort and support from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and also the University of Rhode Island to develop this conceptual model, working with fishing communities in the Gulf of Maine to help address developing understanding of what some of the major indicators are that those communities are concerned about that could feed into the development of an EBM or EBM approach to understanding what the interactions are in developing indicators for measuring change. We had, I'm not going to go into this slide, there's a lot of information, but we had a number of fishing community workshops over the end of 2023, and we identified areas of highest concern, areas of high uncertainty, and suggested adjustments to a conceptual model that we developed. So the conceptual model considered the socioeconomic situation, the environment, the ecology, research and monitoring, such as the impacts that wind development may have on our scientific surveys, which could reduce uncertainty in our assessments of population status, fishing activity impacts, and also the safety at sea. Important components of this were not just losses of revenue, but also changes in human well-being and measures of social health and well-being, which are not necessarily measured by dollar values in fishing communities. So some of the constraints, this is sort of the unsatisfying, but maybe this is the design challenge for our models, is we have limited empirical data to ground truth calibrate or validate our models. We have limited species-specific and life stage-specific data available across these stressors and receptors. We have limited knowledge of the spatial extent of these IPFs, or impact-producing effects. Most of the published studies, again, we are advancing fast, very fast in the United States, and we're seeing publications documenting some of the changes based on where we're at in the process. So this is improving in the U.S., but most of the published studies are from locations in Europe, which are not necessarily applicable to U.S. shelf ecosystems. We have the limited understanding of the spatial scale of these biological impacts. We have efforts to understand that, but we don't necessarily have that data yet. And we have limited information on how wind development will interact with other ecosystem stressors, whether it's fishing gear impacts, climate change impacts, or vessel strike impacts, for instance. And we have a limited ability to integrate across developments because we currently have different methods of sampling and monitoring approaches to collect the data. And sometimes this data isn't necessarily even available to us to integrate into modeling methods. The other thing that we are at a disadvantage of right now is we have no established programs for socioeconomic impacts from offshore wind development. There are some efforts that are beginning, but we don't yet know, and we don't have an integrated system to understand that. So I just want to thank a lot of my colleagues at BOEM and NOAA Fisheries for helping to present this material, and I will leave you with that design challenge of filling those data gaps so we can make sure our models are grounded in understanding of what really is happening in the ocean. Thank you.
G'day. Yeah. Yeah, so we're not seeing it up there. Sorry, folks. So it's not mirroring up there anymore.
A little concerned that if the PowerPoint doesn't get working, I have to do like a stand-up act or something. Knock jokes or something.
Oh, we have the recorded one. We have the recorded one.
And I'm going to give you a really fast rundown on different cumulative effects assessment methods. And first off, I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders of the various lands that we meet on today. So a key distinction to keep in mind is the methods that industry have typically used within environmental impact assessments versus the bigger cross-cutting kind of methods that have typically been used by researchers and government when doing strategic assessments for entire regions. Within industry, they typically look at the layering up of different developments of the same kind, so wind on wind, tourism on tourism, that kind of stuff. And just those kind of interactions that step from what's there now to when there's another implementation of the same kind of industry. And that happens within each industry, whereas when they have the sort of government assessment that takes on that big regional look, it doesn't just look within an industry, but the interconnections between industries and how that can have compound effects on that regional environment. Now, in terms of the methods used, the most common method is GIS, where they layer up in an additive sense the different uses and look for hotspots of overlap. As you get more and more activities or activities of different kind, that becomes increasingly complicated to do. And so what you tend to see happen when you get to a lot of activities happening in an area is that the impact pathways, the way you go from activity to the outcome on the ecosystem, is drawn up in a conceptual sense, and then experts are asked to rate the likelihood and consequence of each one of those steps. It is possible now, though, to think about predictive outcomes, and this is being done increasingly over the last few years. In data limited situation, that's taken a sign, diagraph or qualitative model approach, where you have a conceptual model of the connections within a system with an arrow representing an enhancing effect and a dot representing a depressing or a reducing effect. And then you look at press perturbation, where you say, okay, I'm going to grow offshore wind, and look at how that then flows out across the rest of the system. More dynamic, more quantitative approaches are increasingly common, though, and increasingly asked for under policy. That can start from a GIS basis, where different patterns of development are considered and the cumulative additive effect of those different developments on the underlying habitat is the output that goes into the planning process. Now, that can be done for individual sectors or it can be done for multiple sectors in a region. But the latest advances are going beyond those additive interactions into nonlinear interactions that are habitat or trophic mediated, and that pulls in ecosystem modelling from other fields like fisheries and conservation. Now, thankfully, offshore energy development has come along at a time when there's been literally decades of development of these other methods, such as methods where you take statistical distributions of something you can measure, like depth, and relate that back to the system property you want to think about. Species distribution models, where you look at the preferences of the species and how they're modified by any development or climate change into the future. Models that are based on the fact that a lot of the structuring processes in the ocean are based on size, whether that's sensing or feeding or movement and those kind of things. They're very rapid assessment methods. The most common form of assessment method, though, is still based on trophic connections. EcoPath with EcoSim being a really good example of that, and it's already being used in the offshore development area. Models of intermediate complexity that are really focused on the key interactions around the activity of interest are really commonly used in fisheries and can be brought into sharp focus in the context of offshore energy, particularly around threatened, endangered and protected species. Bayes networks are a way of thinking about probabilistic transformation, so changing one part of the system and the probabilistic steps into other parts of the system. Doesn't do feedback so well, but can bring information across different disciplines like economics and biophysics together. And then the last kind of method that's being increasingly used are highly sophisticated, fully dynamic models that represent their physical environment, age-structured fish populations, up to really true individual representations of rare species such as top predators. All of those allow for nonlinear dynamic interactions, but come with uncertainty, and thanks to the IPCC, there's now some really good ways of trying to express that uncertainty, both in terms of the model uncertainty, but also the uncertainty around the data and knowledge underlying the model, so that can be more clearly expressed. So there are many different facets of all these very different tools, whether they're additive or nonlinear, looking at direct or indirect effects, the kind of spatiotemporal scales involved in the data requirements. But a lot of that is now well understood and documented, and there's a lot of experience around the world that's been increasingly summarised in documents such as that put out by the OES Environmental and into papers such as the one that I've helped co-author recently, and I'm very happy to discuss and follow up on any of this. Thanks.
We do, yeah. Beth, you can come on camera now. There she is.
Yes, just to introduce her again, thank you, Beth Fulton from Australia's National Science Agency, and thank you for joining us for the Q&A session. Okay, so, we had a couple just general questions before we get to some questions from the audience that we asked the panel to think about. Some of these were addressed in the talks, but I just wanted to open it up for anyone who wanted to add to their challenges and lessons learned in the development and implementation of EBM models at your agency. And specifically, if you can, speak to anything related to incorporating the human dimensions. I know several of you touched on it, but anyone want to add anything?
I'll go ahead and I'll take the bullet. So that's something we have talked about a lot, and you know, I said I've been doing this for 20 years, and we've just started being successful for about 5 years. So we're learning, right? And that's one of the things we have learned is like we need to do that better. So one of the the conceptual modeling idea where you bring together stakeholders is one great way to start. Getting that, you know, because we just have a history of people started building these ecosystem models. It was just a bunch of scientists in the room. Here's what we have data for. What can we do with this? And then we slowly started to learn, oh, that's what we can do, but that's what people care about. So let's start trying to understand what people care about, and now how do we start to quantify some of that? And we have a long history of sort of bioeconomic models where you've got all the ecology and you plug in a dollar value of the fish at the end or something. But we're also starting to realize, well, no, actually, fishers make decisions about where they go fishing. So there's those sorts of aspects that we're working towards. But I think, and so most of the models that I've talked about that we use allow you to incorporate some of that, because they're all very modular. So we can start to do that more. One of the things is we need more economists working and social scientists working on these sorts of questions with us, though.
Anyone else?
So I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Oh, yes.
We're working a lot with social scientists as well, particularly behavioural economists, behavioural psychologists, around the way that people think and make decisions and respond. So that modular approach that Howard just spoke about means that you can extend beyond economics into these other fields, particularly if you take an agent-based Bayesian or sign diagraph approach, because all of those are fairly agnostic to the way that you represent things. The biggest issue is typically around the data availability, because we've collected a lot of physical data in the past, a lot of economics data, even social data, but we don't collect very much governance information. So how the actual governance process works. It's a bit insulting to a politician to model him as a random number generator. One of the useful ways forward, though, is that there's a lot of knowledge captured in the traditional knowledge of people who've been around for years looking after integrated approaches to oceans. So capturing the informal governance from those kind of processes can be really insightful, particularly given that groups such as the Indigenous population of Australia have lived through the levels of climate change that we'll see in the next 20 years. And so their deep time stories have a lot of insight into the kinds of change and how people respond to those levels of change.
Great, thank you. Our most popular question from the audience is, how could dynamic modeling take a role in mitigation and compensation discussions?
So, I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at that. I feel like I'd be making it up, though. So if I had to close my eyes and picture how dynamic modeling could impact that, ideally it would forecast future scenarios better and bring to light new types of opportunities that we didn't think of previously for mitigation things. I don't know what that might be. I think of things like, coastal development equivalents with no net loss of wetlands and things like that. I think of what could we see coming down the pike in the future, and how could that inform mitigation now? But I'm pulling this out of thin air here, guys. So
I'm gonna do the same.
Okay.
But so we know ecosystems are changing, right? Regardless if we do wind energy or not, or do anything or not, they're still going to change, right? So if you go ahead and start building models to understand how they might be changing and can plan for that, I think that's a step towards mitigation right away, right? I mean, and so, yeah, I think, if you want to kind of extend that, if you build on some of these economic modules to understand, okay, with the shifting of this species to this area, it's now costing me more to fish, or that sort of thing. You can, for example, provide information so that fishers can decide, whether they want to fish there or not. You might not have to mitigate. You just allow them. You give them some projection forecast to help them make decisions, so that maybe they can circumvent some of those additional costs, or think of ways around it, or plan for other ways of fishing. But there's so many levels to mitigation to think about it. It'd be helpful to have a specific example. I'm just sort of throwing around ideas there. But yeah.
Yeah, in a previous career, I did a lot of watershed projects, restoration, watershed hydrology, and it strikes me, thinking about some of those ecosystem indicators in from the land, which not necessarily applicable to the marine space. But the marine spaces are getting busier, and we're using every piece of it. And so maybe there's some analogs. You think about, so one of the things that came to my mind when you said that, Jay, was I think it was like the 15 or 20% rule of impervious surface cover in a watershed. So a watershed would be that your ecosystem boundary. Right. It was developed as if you reach that threshold, the system starts to fall apart. We have more flooding. It affects organisms. It affects low-lying communities. Are we able to develop similar types of ecosystem indicators that give us a sense of this is the use the term carrying capacity of offshore wind development in the New York Bight before we reach some tipping point where things start to break down. Right. So it strikes me that that we could, if we do the monitoring we might be able to answer those questions and develop those indicators and apply some of the ways that we've managed terrestrial systems.
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, next, how can we communicate effectively with the public about the uncertainties of cumulative impacts? It's challenging to discuss in the context of existing misinformation about offshore wind.
Communicating uncertainty, that's a tough one.
So I'm stealing this idea from Kenny Rose, who's done a lot of individual-based modeling and thought about this. Like, first off, don't communicate to the public about uncertainty. Talk about certainty, which is just the inverse of uncertainty, right? Because there's a lot of people out there with no information who are very certain about what's going to happen, but they have no information, right? So, and so you put yourself on on your back foot already but more specifically, that management strategy evaluation approach, part of it is, each of those levels, there's uncertainty in our surveys that we take into account when we do our assessments. There's uncertainties in, how management is implemented. There's uncertainty in the biophysics. So you can actually begin to, run multiple scenarios and catalog all those. And so if you have a trajectory, so it's not quite statistical uncertainty boundaries, but it's parameter sensitivity and taking into account all those uncertainties and all the other aspects of what's going on, and develop sort of cones of uncertainty like they do with the hurricane forecast. Yeah. I think that's something that folks understand, and we actually had a workshop for our ecosystem modelers back in 2014 where we talked. The whole workshop was dealing with uncertainty. And we got a lot of good advice from the Hurricane Center folks there, But one of the other things is, you think, oh, we're adding all this complexity and it's making it less certain. But also, you're putting in new constraints, right? If one fish eats another, then you can't have this much of this fish if you only have that much of that fish. So it's actually helping to balance some of that uncertainty. Once you start to get these interactions going, it helps to constrain some of your parameters. Or, for example, if you have primary production, right, that provides a bound. And often in our stock assessments, we end up, they change something, when they redo the assessment, and what they thought the initial biomass is now shifted by 50% or 100%, because there's nothing to sort of prevent that windshield wipering. So if you have, primary production, that's, you can't, if you think about the levels of energy transfer up the food web, you can't go beyond that. So it actually helps to bound things a bit. So I think, let's think about the certainty in this a little bit more is my story.
Chime in too. One, I think hopefully this sounds familiar to Jake and Kristen over the course of the project, but I tried to, within our modeling team even, just hammer that really our goal is to create a space to represent all of the best available science. And then the insights coming out of the model are really insights grounded in that established science. So you do want to build certainty in your model, But ultimately, the decisions are being made based on certainty in that best available science, and the model is just the conduit for pulling all of that information together. So, knowing where you're grounded and that being where your certainty is in the process really being important.
Howard, I really liked your
So if I can,
hurricane. Oh, sorry, Beth, go ahead.
yeah, sorry, I can't actually see the panel, so I don't know who's about to talk. So sorry if I keep butting in. One of the benefits of having dynamic kind of models like you've seen today is that you can actually layer games on top of them. So there's a method that they've used in Europe that we're trying to now use in Australia, where you take the dynamic model and you make it the world that people are playing with. And they literally have all different kinds of people, from planning and industry and investors and even the general public, sit in the room together and they play where they're going to put things and see what happens. So they're kind of living the future fast forward. And by experiencing it, they can both understand what's certain and what's not based on, oh, you made that decision and got that result, and I made this decision and got a different result, versus what's consistently the same across all of them. So using that kind of approach, they've had learning in Europe, but in Chile, they've actually started to do communal spatial planning, where the individual villages along the coastline decide what goes where. And that builds up to the government regional planning approach. So once you've got the tools there, you can really immerse people so that they can get their own tangible experience of what's certain and what's not. Because you can talk till you're blue in the face to tell them something, but once they've actually felt it for themselves, there's a much greater appreciation.
I like that a lot. I feel like I should add something, but what am I going to say after that?
Plus, we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, for the U.S. East Coast, do you see EBM more useful for optimizing trade-offs between various stakeholders and species, or more for long-term risk management? Either way, how can EBM be made to work in current U.S. decision-making processes?
I guess I can start on that. So I might need to see the question in front of me, though, because that was like multi-parted and I'll forget. My answer was both. No, I can't see the question. Okay. My answer was both in understanding long-term risk by being able to have that aspect of forecasting or looking into the future there, and also the trade-offs right now in decisions. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think if I could wave my
pulls
magic
them
wand,
together more, right?
Yeah.
It helps them be less separate, actually.
Right. Look, I don't think of them as separate things.
Yeah.
Here, you take this.
I don't think of them as separate things either.
Right.
So when you have these tools, you can vary your time scales.
Yeah.
And so the distinction between near-term trade-offs and long-term risk management is just two ends of a spectrum, and you've really brought them into the same framework.
Right.
You can set for came up that these projects have different phases, so you might focus on the trade-offs associated with one particular phase of it. But if you have the right accounting scheme, then you can also roll that out and look at the really truly cumulative impacts over the entire life cycle.
Right. And the second part of that was how it incorporates.
Either way, how can EBM be made to work in current U.S. decision-making processes? So
I have a dream in my head when I close. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to sound that cheesy. I'm sorry. When I close my eyes, I like to see an EIS that is has data visualization in a way that is logical and makes sense and is easy to communicate, like Howard was saying with the hurricane cones of uncertainty, and so that in our NEPA process, when it comes time to develop alternative scenarios and things like that, we can inform them, but we can have them informed by trade-offs now and into the future, those deferred impacts as well, so that it would have in the in the process that we go through in our, consultations and our various impact assessments and everything like that, we would have that informed by these dynamic models that would show impacts and trade-offs of decisions today, impacts and trade-offs into the future, and all that stuff in a really easy to digest and easy to communicate way. So that's how I see this integrating. I have this dream that the Secretary of Interior is going to call me up and say, "Hey, Jake, can you come over and take this chart with me?" And but maybe that's just kind of a pipe dream. But
Actually, he shared with me he wanted them to send the plane to come get him to do that. So
I didn't realize we were going to air that kind of
we
line.
are.
Careful who you talk to. But I like what you're thinking of there, and I see that as sort of ecosystem-based energy management, and we're doing ecosystem-based fisheries management. How do you take this to ecosystem-based management?
Right.
And so I'm glad that Beth mentioned that management strategy, or what is it called? MSP challenge, or I can't remember what it's called, but No. She was talking about this challenge thing. It's the MSP challenge, Marine Spatial Planning Challenge, that was running out of the Netherlands, I think. And I had an opportunity to do this, right? So you actually have people, this was a plaything, but you're people from the fishery sector, you're people from the energy sector, you're commercial fishers, you're tourist industry folks, and we all were in our groups. And we run the model and see the maps and then make a decision. Well, I want to build more. Somebody was a government minister or whatever. You'd say, let's make this a protected area. Let's do this here. Then you'd run the scenario all together and say, oh, I got not what I wanted out of this. And we then come together and talk and sort of kind of do that in silico experiment, pretend like we were these people. If we could actually get folks from these agencies to do this and sort of, all right, this is a model. It's not real, but it's pretty close, and we can improve upon the model, but just to start having that experience. We don't have a governance structure to bring all these people, and it'd be quite expensive, frankly, to run the MSP challenge and to bring the groups together. But I think, I'm just kind of riffing off of Beth's idea there. That I think that would be, let's get the multiple agencies working together in a way like that.
So, Andy, can I ask you a question? Not to put you on the spot here, but you mentioned the ecosystem-based fisheries and how I talked about ecosystem-based energy. What is that? What does that look like, given the constraints of the governance structure that we have?
So I'm the perfect person to answer this question because I work for a science center. We're not the decision makers, they're the managers. I don't know. What is our U.S. government goal is 30 gigawatts by 2030, and promoting. There's a clause to it, and promoting ocean co-use and marine biodiversity. So that's our EB. That's like a piece of an EBM challenge to our agencies. These tools can be helpful to account for those interactions or trade-offs if we have the stomach to be transparent about what the interactions are. And my presentation was all about there's a lot of uncertainty around these interactions because we have not measured the interactions at the scale that we need to measure them across the seascapes that we're posing development for. So I'm not answering your question.
No, you're not, because where I sit in the studies program, there's a very real financial limitation to the things that we can monitor and the things that we can do, just like there is at NOAA, right? And so how we solve that I don't want to say keeps me up at night, but that's one of the things that keeps me up at night is how do we prioritize those monitoring efforts so that they best inform these models with the limited resources that we have, right?
I would say that this challenge, there is also an opportunity because we are effectively, not just the U.S., but the world offshore wind is presenting a marine industrialization, we haven't seen in the ocean. And so with that industrialization is resources, and they need science to do what they need to do to plan their projects and to de-risk their projects, right. And science helps. So there's a significant level of investment that's happening from the project level on up. And so how do we harness those resources collectively to do something coherent and link what we measuring the response of the ecosystem to what we think these forecasts are in terms of what the potential changes are, the modeling. And the modeling efforts can help us think about what are the key pieces that we need to be monitoring to make them more cost effective, whether they're like conceptual models that stakeholders participated in, or hydrodynamic and biological models. These are the key things that we need to be monitoring. Those things we're all smart enough to figure out. It just needs to be deployed at scale and across projects in the ecosystem, and maybe we can really see some efficiencies.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, did you just hide?
That's okay. I'm going to try to get one more in. We've got 5 minutes, and I'm going to go to one that's more broader for the panel, but there are a number of questions that I hope we'll be able to follow up with afterwards. But for this one, it's how should the end goal of EBM be considered when designing monitoring at offshore wind developments? Should monitoring be regional rather than site-specific?
I'm scared to, yeah.
It kind of has to be both, right? I mean, there's already regional monitoring happening for a lot of things, and you do need to do the site-specific. And I think the modeling is the way to kind of connect those. But I don't think
I don't think it's one or the other.
Yeah, everybody's asking either or, and we want everything, not just.
Okay, then I'll jump to one for
Ideally,
Howard.
you'd link them.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, ideally, you'd do it hierarchically. So you'd have a strategic regional plan, and the individual proponents would nest into that so that they create a network that brings you together that whole regional information in a more structured way, which is why it's great to have those strategic ecosystem assessments first and then have the individual proponents slot in underneath so you get bigger bang for buck learning from the oceanographic world that takes that kind of whole-filling approach.
Okay, thank you. All right, for the last one, for Howard, has NIMS done any ecosystem modeling to predict hydrodynamic food web impacts of offshore wind in southern New England? Why or why not?
Oh, that might be a better thing for you.
We're pursuing joint work with Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, coming off of the National Academy's report and convening, and then last week's workshop on monitoring. So there's a number of interagency and academic partnerships that are being formalized. Is Chris still in the? Chris Orphanides could talk a little bit more about it, but there are joint efforts. It's not just a NOAA effort.
The National Academy's report is actually, I saw a stack of them here in the front hall. So
Yeah. And I would say in all of our science centers, we have ecosystem models that would be good foundations for any of this sort of work. And that's, I told you about the ideal way of doing things, like, have a conceptual model and then build the model to fit to the purpose. But in actuality, we've built a lot of models for different things. You've now got the expertise and understanding and data streams where you can more readily begin to, with new stressors, new events, to start to build those in. So I think that's kind of the key things. Like, you can't just do sort of one and done. All right, there's my ecosystem model. I put it away. I'm done. I'm walking away. It's like, nope. You got to care and feed for it. Get it reviewed. Get it used. Use it to learn what's a key thing that we need to know here to help with projections, forecasts, whatever that would improve our advice we come from the model, and kind of keep using them. So,
thank you.
Thank you. What? Done? Okay. There are a number of questions, so
so we can go through it and provide some text responses and stuff. But I think this concludes our session. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Yes,
and,
thank you very much to our panelists.
Great, and just a couple of quick reminders. So side meetings are happening this afternoon. There's one in here, and the rest are upstairs on the 3rd floor. And then the Tech Cafe this evening from 5:30 to 8 is over in a different building in the Stony Brook Union. Thanks, Beth, for tuning in so early in the morning for you.
Thank you. No worries. See ya. Have fun.
Yeah, right.